Chicago-style Dixieland flourished in the 1920s. Storyville in New Orleans closes in 1917, and when it does, we've talked about how this created this exodus out of New Orleans as musicians moved northward, seeking more employment after their chief source of employment in New Orleans had been shut down during this wartime measure. And as I said, I didn't think that it was something that the people that closed Storyville or those that thought one way or another about jazz really planned. I think it was something that just happened as a result of this closing of Storyville, that we see so many musicians beginning to drift out of New Orleans area and move into larger cities in the north. In cities like Chicago, like Kansas City, like New York, Los Angeles. Chicago seemed to be one of the more prosperous cities of this time. And not only do we see a lot of musicians moving northward to seek more employment, but into the 1920s there was also a lot of blue-collar workers that were moving out of the South and moving northward, seeking higher-paying jobs and hopefully a better way of life. And so there seemed to be not only musicians moving northward because of the closing of Storyville, but also it seemed that the audience was moving northward too. Jazz seemed to be in demand throughout the 1920s for many reasons. Remember that the main purpose of jazz at this point was that it was a dance music, and had been all throughout the days of New Orleans-style Dixieland. Large dance halls were being built throughout the 1920s. There was this dance craze that seemed to sweep the nation that started somewhere around 1910. And social dancing seemed to be really the thing. And so we have lots of dance halls being built in metropolitan areas. Roseland, for example, in New York City, was built during this time to accommodate this dance craze that seemed to be happening not just in New York, but throughout the nation. Some other things that take place that further the spread of jazz and cause a demand for it. We have a radio broadcast in 1920 and a nationwide link-up as early as 1926. We see that jazz becomes something sought after because so much of the music that was being played on the radio in the 1920s was jazz. It seemed to be what people wanted to hear. People were dancing to it a lot, and it seemed to be something that occupied a lot of airtime. It really changed the way that bands and individual star soloists began to develop their careers, because now for the first time in history you could become famous in a metropolitan area without ever even setting foot in that area. For example, a nationwide link from New York to Los Angeles, a band that became very famous in New York and performed on a live radio broadcast could become very popular in Los Angeles without ever going to that city at all. So this began to change the band building system and the way that a lot of people begin to think about recording, and also certainly radio became something that people sought after in terms of trying to get their recordings played and get on some live radio broadcasts as well, because it was certainly beginning to have an impact as we see throughout the 1920s. The very first talking movie occurred during this time, and jazz was occasionally used as background music for talking movies, and so there's another source for jazz to be spread throughout the country. The very first jukebox occurred in 1927, and it was called an Amplivox. People in a South Chicago restaurant were amazed that they could hear the sound of Louis Armstrong and others coming through this machine. And this Amplivox really caught on as a way of providing people with recorded music. And jazz was certainly a part of the early Amplivoxes and showed up as part of your choices that you could listen to. The recording industry really began to blossom during the 1920s. For one thing, the economy was really pretty good in the United States. It was a real industrial revolution during this time, and I mentioned that lots of blue-collar jobs in metropolitan areas and people moving into these areas to find these jobs. And so people had more spending money than perhaps they'd had in the past. And the recording industry really began to blossom, and especially in the area of jazz. In 1901, we have a conglomerate that is formed. Columbia and Edison were joined by Victor and formed one of the largest record companies in the United States. I already mentioned that in 1909 we had recording of pop music on cylinders, where you'd have this horn with a rubber diaphragm at the end of it with a needle attached to this rubber diaphragm, and the sound waves would travel through the horn, set the rubber vibrating, and of course the needle, and it would etch it right into the cylinder, sometimes made of wax. Molds were made of these cylinders, and we had and then had them mass produced and sold in stores. And of course a few years later we go to flat discs, but still using the same process, this process of everything done acoustically, where you have this horn with the rubber diaphragm and etching sound right into this wax plate, and molds being made of it using vinyl and shellac, and producing flat records. We know that in 1917 the very first jazz was recorded. It was the original Dixieland jazz band, Nick LaRocca, and recorded in New York City. And of course, a band that had its roots in New Orleans, but as I said, not perhaps one of the best bands in New Orleans during this time. The very first black jazz band, recorded in 1921, Kid Ory, a trombone player from New Orleans, had traveled to Chicago because of the closing of Storyville, and he became the very first black musician to record jazz. And after these two sort of landmark events in the history of jazz, many, many other people began to record, because this fear that they had of recording is now replaced by this desire or necessity to be recorded if you're going to make it in the music business. And of course, that continues to this day. 1925, Columbia and Victor produced an electrical method of recording, and producing recordings at 78 revolutions per minute of a turntable. And the old 78 RPMs seemed to stick with the recording industry for about the next 20 years. And it's not until 1947 that we have LP records that we finally can turn the speed of the turntable down to 33 1/3 and get more time on one side of the record. I think this limitation of 78 RPM plays a big part in recorded jazz throughout the 1920s and 30s, where we see most jazz pieces during this time from anywhere to 3 to 5 minutes in length, and that's about it. And I think one of the reasons why this length seemed to be pretty consistent is that restriction that was placed in recording studios of the 78 RPM records. You only have so much time on one side before the record has to be flipped over. And at 78 RPM, and actually those older records were even smaller in diameter than LP records, you can see that there was just not very much time on one side, and I do think that that plays a part in recorded jazz. When we take a look at Chicago in the 1920s, it was like any other large metropolitan area in the United States. This was the roaring 20s. Life seemed to be a party. Goldfish swallowing and flagpole sitting were some of the things that college students did during the 1920s. Stuffed Bearcat cars were very popular, and raccoon coats. Life was good. The economy was good, and no one had in mind 1929 and the stock market crash and the depression that would set in for many years after. Life was good. Life was to be celebrated, and a really very happy times. Many people were making more money than they ever had, moving into higher paying jobs, and so music always reflects the life and times of people. And so we see that in these prosperous conditions that music reflects this. We'll see that Chicago style Dixieland tempos were a little faster, a little brighter perhaps than the older New Orleans style, and all of this due to this roaring 20s atmosphere that seemed to pervade throughout this decade. If we take a look at Chicago during the 1920s, we see that Chicago had its own problems too. I mean, life was good, but there was also some problems. Organized crime was very organized in Chicago, and very much controlled the city. City government, judges, police chiefs, all had been corrupted by organized crime, and various families would dominate various sections of the city. And there would be all kinds of, occasionally, gangland wars when one family would try to take over a little more territory within the city. By now, Prohibition had come into effect. And with alcohol and the advertisement of alcohol being illegal, organized crime found that that was a very good money-making opportunity to bootleg, to provide alcohol illegally. And so bars were set up across the city called speakeasies. And you would walk down an alley and knock on a door, and a trap door would open, and you would say a password, and they would let you in these speakeasies if you knew the password. And inside there would be a bar set up with alcohol flowing, and of course over on the stage would be a Chicago-style Dixieland band playing for a dance. So it seems like we finally move out of Storyville and our association with gambling and drinking and prostitution, and now jazz ends up in speakeasies, which were these illegal bars, many of them organized crime controlled, and very dangerous places. And it's like, will this music ever gain any kind of respectability and acceptance when it keeps ending up in places like this? However, it was a place for musicians to perform, and they were paid fairly well for playing in speakeasies. There was a lot of money to be made in bootlegging. When we look at Chicago-style Dixieland and music during the 1920s surrounding Chicago style, for a while, in the earlier part of the 1920s, we have a lot of these older, more experienced New Orleans musicians moving to town, and especially playing in the south side of Chicago. And so perhaps for a while this older New Orleans style was preserved in Chicago. We already know that city blues were also very popular during the 1920s and coexist with Chicago-style Dixieland. And also, on the north side of Chicago, we have a newer style of Dixieland that is beginning to develop, mostly by younger musicians trying to imitate these older New Orleans musicians that have moved to town. And so I think for a while in Chicago we had this older style of Dixieland coexisting with a newer style of Dixieland that was beginning to emerge. And by the end of the decade, it seemed like this newer style had pretty much established itself in the city. And of course, city blues being a style that is separate from jazz, influencing jazz certainly, but a style that still remains separate from jazz, that coexisted with this new style of Dixieland that emerges in the 1920s. These new Dixieland groups were very respectful of the older New Orleans musicians that were coming into town. In fact, many names like New Orleans Rhythm Kings and Louisiana Rhythm Kings were made up of Chicago musicians, young Chicago musicians, that had never been to New Orleans. But they were so fascinated with these older players moving to town that they would name their groups after them in honor of these great musicians that were moving to town. In Chicago, we have several types of employment opportunities that perhaps that we see were not the case with New Orleans. For example, speakeasies. Chicago was under Prohibition. New Orleans, when New Orleans style Dixieland flourished, Prohibition was not in existence, and so there was no need for speakeasies. But in Chicago, a speakeasy became a great source of employment for musicians, and something that provided them quite a bit of work. And of course, being an illegal bar, a little bit different atmosphere than what you had seen in New Orleans, where Storyville and all of its saloons were very open in the days before Prohibition. Ballroom dancing, another source of employment for Chicago musicians. There was all kinds of movie and vaudeville theaters throughout Chicago where they would hire a band to play in between the showings of a movie. So you might go to work in the morning, the movie would be shown, the band would come on and play for a little bit, the movie would be shown again, the band would come back on and play, and this sort of cycling would go on all day into the night as audiences would pay their way into the theater to see the movie and of course to hear the band perform as well. And sometimes there was these vaudeville shows. It could be anything from comedy acts to all sorts of various types of entertainment that might take place as well in between the showings of the movie. So Dixieland bands were just sort of a part of all that kind of entertainment that might occur in between the showings of movies in these Chicago movie theaters. Recording industry is also something that was different. New Orleans, of course, recording industry really had no effect on New Orleans-style Dixieland other than the musicians down there tried to avoid it. They were afraid of it. And by the time we hit the 1920s in Chicago style, musicians are no longer afraid of it. They begin to see that the recording industry is really something they need if they're going to promote their career and their band and their music. So recording was really beginning to blossom for jazz, and jazz musicians sought after ways that they could be recorded. If life is a party, and it certainly was during the 1920s and the Roaring 20s, as some people have referred to it, and music always reflects the life and times of people, then we see some kind of crazy things that take place. For example, we see recordings of that come out of the 1920s with some really unusual instruments, instruments that had not been associated with jazz. For example, violin. There's several recordings of Chicago-style Dixieland where a violin is being used within a group. Violin was not a common instrument associated with jazz, and however, it is one instrument that, to a certain degree anyway, has become a valid jazz instrument. And we have people like Jean-Luc Ponty and Stephen Grappelli that have made careers out of performing jazz on violin. And we'll talk about an early pioneer during this time of using violin to perform jazz on, but not one of the more common, perhaps, instruments that are associated with jazz. We even have recordings of harp, which probably not to be taken seriously. I'm sure that even some recordings of using the violin was also sort of a joke, maybe even poking a joke at classical music. You know, let's get a harp and a violin and have them sit in with our jazz band, and just as a sort of crazy thought and a reflection of this craziness that seemed to pervade the 1920s. Certainly a kazoo is an example of this real craziness that takes place during the 1920s. Some of the characteristics of Chicago-style Dixieland that perhaps separated from the older New Orleans style you see listed here on the screen. Chicago style was generally faster, had a little more drive and a little more energy, which is not surprising because, remember, music always reflects the life and times of people. And when you're in a decade that is known as the Roaring 20s and a decade where economic conditions are really pretty good, then music will certainly reflect that. And tempo is one of those ways that reflects this this mood that people seem to be in. Individual solos become more and more important. Remember, we've talked about ensemble section, solo section, ensemble, which is the overall plan that these Dixieland musicians used. What are we going to do from the very first note that we play of this tune to the very last note? How are we going to organize it? And so their plan was, we play the melody down first, we improvise in the middle, and we play the melody down again at the end. And remember that ensemble section, solo section, ensemble section is completely different than form, which is how melodies are organized. Remember, you can take any melody, which would have any kind of form to it, and plug it in to this overall plan, which was play the melody at the beginning, improvise in the middle, and play the melody again at the end. Well, so whatever form that the melody would happen to be in, it certainly could be plugged into this overall plan of ensemble section, solo section, ensemble. With Chicago, we see that the solo section, the one in the middle where the improvisation takes place, becomes more and more important. And rather than having group improvisation, which happened with New Orleans, we begin to see solo improvisation. In other words, instead of having all the frontline instruments improvise at once, we begin to have one at a time being preferred. Also in Chicago, we see meter shifts taking place, where in the older New Orleans style, the old-timers have told us that the meter was in 4, where we had 4 beats or 4 natural pulsations per bar. And every one of the beats seemed to be accented. However, with the newer Chicago style, it seems that instead of 4 beats per measure, we've switched it to 2 beats, or they switched it to 2 beats per measure, and the second beat seems to be accented. So if you have an accent on a weak beat rather than a strong beat, because remember, 1 is always a strong beat in a measure, and if you accent a weak beat, then you set up rhythmic syncopation. Something else we've talked about before. And that's exactly what happens here with Chicago-style Dixieland, is that we see rhythmic syncopation coming from the drummer, where he would accent the second beat and set up this conflict within the rhythm. And this may be one of the first times that we see this rhythmic syncopation entering into jazz, which has continued with jazz throughout the 20th century on into the 21st century, and also something that has been a part of many other styles of music as well. I'd like for you to click on a couple examples here. The first one is New Orleans style, and I'd like for you to click on this example and listen to this. This is a band recording the older New Orleans style and trying to be as historically correct as possible. This was not recorded during the days of New Orleans. It was recorded much later, but again, they're trying to be as historically correct as possible. So on the Chicago style example, you'll hear the same melody that you heard with the New Orleans example. And again, this was not recorded during the days of Chicago style, but recorded much later with a group of musicians trying to come as historically correct as possible. And listen to the difference between Chicago and New Orleans style. In fact, if you want to go back and listen to the New Orleans style again, after you've listened to the Chicago style, to hear these differences. Some other things that you will hear on these recordings. Guitar replaces the banjo with Chicago style. Banjo seemed to be a popular instrument in the rhythm section of the older New Orleans style. Guitar seems to replace that in the 1920s. String bass seems to be preferred over the tuba. One of the reasons is obvious that there was no marching in Chicago. Chicago was a much colder climate, and the outdoor marching seemed to be something that just did not happen with Chicago style. Whereas New Orleans, of course, that was really where the roots of many of these New Orleans Dixieland bands, that's where they came from, is out of these early marching bands of the late 1800s. So string bass really replacing the tuba here in Chicago style. Also, we would have the bass player playing on the first beat, which would provide this sort of low, soft sound, and we would have the drummer play on the second beat, providing this heavy accent. And of course, the result of that low, softer sound on one and this heavier accent on two is rhythmic syncopation. Chicago style also contained elaborate introduction and codas. Rather than starting right at the very beginning of the form of a melody during the ensemble section, it became common practice to tack on a few extra bars to introduce what is to come. It's really not part of the form. It was just made it more interesting rather than starting right at the very beginning of the A section of the form. They would tack on a few measures before you get to the A section, and that became known as the introduction. And likewise at the end, after you've played the ensemble section, after everybody has improvised during the solo section, and after we return back to the ensemble section at the end, it became common practice, rather than ending right at the end of the form, tack on a few extra measures at the end to make it more interesting. And this became known as a coda. Coda means tail, and it was just a few extra measures tacked on to make the whole tune more interesting, rather than just ending right at the end of the last section of melody. Much of the music in Chicago-style Dixieland was written out during the ensemble sections, whereas in New Orleans style, it seemed like the trumpet player knew the melody, clarinet would make up something above the melody, and trombone would make up something below the melody. With Chicago style, the notes were written out, so that the trumpet player knew exactly what he was supposed to play, so did the clarinet player, so did the trombone player. However, when it came time for the solo section, improvisation still took place. So remember that when we talk about the music being written out in Chicago, I'm talking about only the ensemble sections, not the solo section. The solo section still contained improvisation, which, as I mentioned earlier, was really becoming even more important in Chicago style than it had been in the earlier New Orleans style. Musicians of Chicago-style Dixieland. Some we will see moving in from New Orleans, and we'll see some familiar names. We'll also see some new people associated with this style. One of the great musicians to become associated with Chicago-style Dixieland and to become not only nationally but also internationally famous is Louis Armstrong. You may remember in our discussion, King Oliver, who was also very popular in Chicago, moved to Chicago after the closing of Storyville in 1922, and shortly after that sends for Louis to come and join his band in Chicago, which Louis Armstrong, who said that he would never leave New Orleans, only if King Oliver were the one that requested that he go somewhere else. That would be the only way that he would leave New Orleans. And so King Oliver did that, requesting that Louis come to Chicago, and he did. And while playing with King Oliver, Louis became more and more famous throughout Chicago. He began to record on his own with a group called the Hot Five and the Hot Seven, and became, by the end of the decade, not just nationally, but as I said, internationally known, with European tours. And so by far, the most important, the most influential of all of the 1920s jazz musicians and on into the 1930s was Louis Armstrong. Another group of musicians became known as the Austin High Gang. It's a group of young white musicians in Chicago that would often make their way into South Chicago to hear King Oliver and Louis Armstrong perform, and many of them attending a high school called Austin High. And this group of young musicians were fascinated with Chicago-style Dixieland. They or this older New Orleans style that was coming into town, and fascinated with Louis Armstrong and King Oliver and their playing. They would go and listen to these musicians play and come back and try to imitate what they were hearing these older New Orleans musicians do. And in doing so, they created their own version of Dixieland, which is really Chicago style. We talked about some of the differences between Chicago and New Orleans style. And it was really the Austin High Gang that helped to form this newer style of Dixieland by imitating these older New Orleans musicians that had moved into town. Austin High Gang was never the name of the band. It was rather just a sort of collection of these young musicians from the northern part of Chicago who got together and recorded with various bands and on various record labels. I'd like for you to listen to an example of some of the members of the Austin High Gang. You see their names printed there. Gene Krupa, who was a drummer. Eddie Condon was a guitar player. Benny Goodman, a clarinetist, who we'll talk quite a bit about a little later on. Jimmy McPartland was a trumpet player. Frank Teschmacher was a clarinetist. Bud Friedman, saxophonist. And Bix Beiderbecke was a cornetist. And we will also talk about Bix in just a minute. I'd like for you to listen to a recording made in 1927. It's called Sugar, and Eddie Condon, the guitar player, was the leader of this particular band, and this will give you an idea of what these young white musicians, collectively known as the Austin High Gang, sounded like in their attempts to imitate King Oliver, Louis Armstrong, and others. Was one of the first, I guess, tragedies in jazz. Bix died when he was 29, born in early 1900s, and dies in the early 1930s. Bix was kicked out of school because it seemed like all that he was interested in was music. People described him that he used to walk the streets like a dreamer, but when it came to practicing and playing music, Bix was incredible. Bix eventually dropped out of school and began playing with many Chicago groups, and became very famous for his sound quality and his ability to improvise. He also became friends of Louis Armstrong, and while Louis was a black musician and Bix Beiderbecke a white musician, they were not allowed to perform with each other on stage, and so after hours the doors would shut and the two of them would play jam sessions together. A lot of respect, mutual respect, with Louis Armstrong and Bix Beiderbecke. Louis really enjoyed his sound, and which shows up on recordings. Interesting thing with Bix Beiderbecke is that he never learned how to read music, and the stories go that they would give him a newspaper in a recording studio. He would go read the newspaper, listen to them rehearse, and come back and improvise his part. And they said that it was always wonderful in what he would do. Bix would mail his parents recordings that he had made with various groups in Chicago, and as he began to travel in other parts of the United States, his parents were very much against Bix being a musician. And these German immigrant parents really felt that he was wasting his time. His real name was Bismarck, and it got shortened to Bix, the name that everybody knew him by. And after playing on Paul Whiteman's band, a band that we'll be talking about a little later, that was billed as the King of Jazz, which in fact really didn't have all that much to do with jazz, but the band was very famous and paid very well. And after a stint with Paul Whiteman, eventually Bix Beiderbecke moves back home and eventually dies of complications with lung problems and also alcoholism. I'd like for you to listen to an example of Bix Beiderbecke. This is called Somebody Stole My Gal, and I'd like for you to listen to one of Chicago's great trumpet players. One of the best groups in Chicago was the Wolverine Orchestra. In fact, this was Bix Beiderbecke's first big break, was playing in the Wolverine Orchestra. They were one of the better known groups throughout Chicago, and made many recordings with the very best musicians in Chicago. with the recording industry now booming, musicians would travel from one group to the next for recording purposes. Of course, that's not something that we saw in New Orleans, where they seemed to stay with one group for a long period of time and would never cross back and forth between groups. But now this seemed to be very commonplace. Whatever they needed to make a recording, they would get in touch with these people, and they would be there regardless of whether they played in someone else's band. I'd like for you to listen to an example of one of Chicago's better bands of the 1920s, and listen to the Wolverine Orchestra performing Jazz Me Blues. Chicago Rhythm Kings were also another very fine group that recorded in Chicago and performed in other parts of the country as well. Muggsy Spanner was another trumpet player, and although probably not as well known as Bix Beiderbecke, or certainly not as well known as Louis Armstrong, quite important and influential to Chicago-style Dixieland, and I'd like for you to listen to an example of Muggsy Spanner. This is called Everybody Loves My Baby. It's a pop song from the 1920s in 32-bar AABA form, and which was kind of typical of Chicago-style Dixieland musicians. They seemed to prefer these pop 32-bar AABA songs and sort of transforming them into into a jazz style and improvising on them. So if you click on this example and listen to Everybody Loves My Baby. Chicago style is really not just limited to Chicago. Just like New Orleans was the focal point of Dixieland in the first couple decades of the 20th century, Chicago became the focal point in the third decade of the 20th century, in the 1920s. New York also had musicians performing Dixieland style, and although we really not refer to it as New York style, they in essence were playing the same style that was being played in Chicago. But there were some very important and influential musicians there living in New York that were involved in Dixieland in the 1920s as well, such as Red Nichols, one of the best trumpet players in New York in the 1920s, performing Dixieland. Miff Mole and his Little Molars. Miff Mole was a trombone player, and I guess if your name is Miff Mole, you can probably have a band called And His Little Molars, and at least it worked for him. I'd like for you to listen to an example of Miff Mole on trombone and his Little Molars, and this is called Original Dixieland One Step. Also living in New York in the 1920s was a violinist by the name of Joe Venuti. Joe Venuti really pioneered the use of violin in jazz and making it a valid jazz instrument. Joe Venuti was always known as the great practical joker in the music business. There's all kinds of stories about Joe Venuti, most of which I really can't tell you because they get pretty graphic and pretty gross, frankly. But one story was when he decided to call up 41, I believe the number was 41 string bass players out when he was in California, and have them all meet him at 7:30 in the evening at Hollywood and Vine dressed up in a tuxedo. And so he individually called up all of these bass players, and they did. They showed up. And here's 41 string bass players standing on the street corner at 7:30 in the evening, and Venuti goes driving by in a taxi cab and just waves at them. he said he just wanted to see what it looked like to see 41 string bass players dressed up in a tuxedo standing on the street corner. While Venuti thought that was pretty funny, the musicians union did not think it so funny. It was so funny, and in fact, they fined him a night's salary for all of those bass players that were standing there looking at each other, wondering what in the world's going on here. So it must have been quite a sight, but an expensive one, I guess, for Venuti. There's a lot of other stories about Joe Venuti and his practical jokes. But I'd like for you to listen to Joe Venuti, the violinist, and also a vocalist on this recording, who was important to Dixieland by the name of Jack Teagarden, who also played trombone. I'd like for you to click on the example of Vale Street Blues and listen to Joe Venuti and Jack Teagarden. The Dixieland that survives today probably in many ways resembles the Chicago style more so than the older New Orleans style. Although there is certainly some of the older New Orleans style still preserved, probably more of the Dixieland groups, of which there's not all that many, perform more in the Chicago style, the meter into accenting the second beat, so on and so forth, all of those characteristics that we've mentioned earlier. At the end of this decade, the 1920s, we'll see that the next focal point for jazz seems to be New York, and brings with that change in location some new styles of music. Chicago still remains important to jazz, as many great musicians continue to live and work in Chicago, and we'll be talking about those, but New York really becomes the focal point as we approach the 1930s. The end of Chicago-style Dixieland, I think, could be blamed on several things. First of all, the Great Depression. No one had in mind, in a decade that was known as the Roaring Twenties, and life was a party, that the stock market crash would occur in 1929 and usher in what became known as the Great Depression, which is extremely high unemployment. And when people are unemployed, one of the things that immediately they cut back on, of course, is entertainment. And so the entertainment business and the music business were really hurt by the Depression. And so many bands being put out of business due to the Depression, which lasts for many years after this, on into the 1930s. Also, the end of Prohibition in 1934, I really think hurt Chicago-style Dixieland. When you think of the speakeasies, which were these illegal bars in Chicago, that really helped Chicago-style Dixieland, because that enabled these musicians to play in small settings and these small Dixieland groups to continue to develop and work. When Prohibition ends, people can go to large metropolitan ballrooms and have a drink and not be afraid of being raided by the police. And when you play in a large ballroom, you need to have more players, because these were the days where PA systems and microphones were not really very developed. And so you needed more musicians to fill up the hall, to cover the crowd noise. And we seem to be headed into the 1930s towards bigger bands to accommodate this dancing craze, that as the Depression ends, this dance craze begins to heat up once again, but only this time without Prohibition, which means that we're headed for larger ballrooms. And so Prohibition actually helped Chicago-style Dixieland and let this small group style of jazz flourish and provided them a place to play. After Prohibition, though, Chicago style begins to dwindle, and we see some of the better musicians beginning to move towards these larger bands in order to find work, and of course performing in these large metropolitan ballrooms that seem to be springing up throughout the early part of the 1920s, and actually maybe even beginning earlier than that, slightly. So that seems to be the end of Chicago-style Dixieland, is the Depression really hurting it, and of course Prohibition that had helped it for so long. Now we see musicians moving towards these larger ensembles, which is a topic that we will pick up a little later.